pleasant good night to all of you. Welcome to this 2012 lecture series entitled, "This is the Time to Knock on the Door of Your Government, Clement Payne, the 1937 Labor Rebellion." Tonight's lecture will be delivered by Dr. David Browne. It is entitled "Seedbed for Protest, Barbados in the 1920s and 1930s." Dr. Browne is the principal of Queen's College. He holds a BA in History and Political Science, an MPhil, Master of Philosophy, in History, and a PhD in History from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. He is the author of a book called Atlantic Interactions, published by Arundel Publishers in 2008. This is a book for Cape history. He's also the author of a publication entitled Race, Class, Politics, and the Struggle for Empowerment in Barbados, 1914 to 1937, also published by Arundel Publishers in 2011, and this book will be launched shortly at the University of the West Indies on March the 8th. He has co-authored several publications on Caribbean Studies for CSE. He's written several articles and book chapters on Barbadian history in the period 1914 to 1937. Moreover, Dr. Browne has done considerable research on the UNIA branches in Barbados and the Working Men's Association. Tonight, we are proud to have such an eminent researcher who has done a lot of spade work on this period within Barbadian history to present this lecture entitled "Seedbed for Protest, Barbados in the 1920s and 1930s." Let's put our hands together and welcome Dr. David Browne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week, ladies and gentlemen, you heard Dr. Bell, who delivered a lecture in which he put the working class movement in a global context. This lecture tonight, entitled "Seedbed for Protest, Barbados during the 1920s and 1930s, come at a very important time. In fact, when I looked at the title of this lecture, I pondered over it a lot because I really got a lot to say, and I'm aware of the limitations of time and such, like and what you can absorb within a lecture. Tonight is going to deal with the period in the 1920s and 1930s, try to give an understanding of what Barbados was like at that period that could have led eventually to what we call the riots of July 1937. Now, in order to understand the nature of protests in early 20th century Barbados, it is necessary to get a grasp of the nature of Barbadian society as it existed during this period. A small white merchant planter elite, for example, dominated Barbadian society economically, socially, and politically. This elite owned and controlled the majority of land in the form of a plantation system that dominated the physical landscape from rural to urban communities. The landless state of Barbadian emancipation in the 19th century continued well into the 20th century, where the majority of the black population owned little land, but lived in dilapidated chattel houses or rented land on plantation tenantries. People were poor, with diets lacking in protein and high in carbohydrates, so many vitamin deficiency diseases were observed. With an infant mortality rate fluctuating between 270 to 400 per 1,000 births, many infants were spared the horrors of Barbadian life. The British Colonial Advisory, Medical and Sanitary Committee condemned the state of affairs in Barbados as unacceptable. Yet, a public health commission in 1925 refused to act decisively to eradicate the sanitary conditions that led to such a high infant mortality rate. Instead, two prominent members of the commission, J.W. Hawkins and J.A. Hanschel, argued that the high infant mortality rate was a good thing for Barbados, a kind of crude birth control method in a densely populated island. Dr. Hawkins, in his testimony before the 1929 West India Sugar Commission, argued that the excessive death rate in the island is only due to the infants. And since, to quote him, the mothers are not able to raise them and there's nowhere to put them, like animals, there's nowhere to pasture them, and you may as well let them die when they come, unquote. Hanschel and Hawkins and many members of the ruling elite never considered high infant mortality rate as a waste of human resources. Sugar and its byproducts constituted 97% of Barbados' exports in the 1920s and the 1930s. And the vast majority of people were employed on the estates and in the factories and foundries. Employment was seasonal, and as the Dean Commission demonstrated, the prices, like today, always gallop ahead of the wages. Wages were lower, where the average wage for men at 1937 were 1 shilling 6 pence, and for women from 10 pence to 1 shilling 3 pence per day. The Dean Commission also demonstrated that wages on the estates in Barbados had remained unchanged for almost 100 years. In other words, what people were being paid in 1937, they received in 1838 at the end of emancipation. I recall interviewing a man, Mr. Best, in 1987 from St. George, and he told me that when he started to work in 1935 for one shilling a day, that 1 shilling a day he started to work for in 1935 was what an engineer would have received in 1838. There was a reason why the Barbadians planters were able to keep wages so steady. It was the high population and the fact that the workers had little room to maneuver, as I was sure, or even to leave Barbados en masse to create any uncertainty in the labor market. In true Gramscian hegemonic fashion, the domination of the merchant planter class was most fittingly demonstrated by the control exhibited over the legislature through a severely restricted franchise set at £50 per annum. The vast majority of the landless working poor who earn a few shillings a week could not qualify. Hence, they remain politically disenfranchised and unable to make a meaningful contribution to the colony's political process. For example, in 1937, of a total population of 195,235 people, only 2,313 people could vote. The majority of these people on the voters' list were members of the ruling elite or their supporters. Charles Duncan O'Neill, from the time he returned to Barbados around 1914, protested against this state of affairs, and he actively recruited black Barbadians who may have met the qualifications for the franchise. Clennell Wickham, his good friend, used the Barbados Weekly Herald newspaper to campaign for the right to vote by the black population, and so devoted much time and energy to bring it before the bar of public opinion. For example, Writing in the Barbados Weekly Herald, April the 9th, 1927, Wickham commented, and I want to quote Wickham: "The working class of Barbados must fight for the franchise. There must be no abatement of the struggle until the right to vote is won. Every day, I am more and more convinced of that since the governor decided the extension of the franchise was not a matter in which the government could take initiative. Political freedom and political activity is the only measure of salvation in Barbados, and no governor, however well-intentioned, will be able to do his job thoroughly until there is a broader and wider basis of representation. I do not despair that Barbadians will one day wake up to their duties and interests," unquote. The governor that Wickham was referring to a delegation who met the new governor, Charles Robinson, on the 12th of September 1925. The delegation included Charles Duncan O'Neill, J.A. Barrett, B.L. Barrow, J. Chandler, Clennell Wickham, and W. Delaney. Wickham read a petition which called for a radical reduction in income qualification from £50 to £25, and property qualifications from £5 to £2 5 shillings. He also acted as the spokesman for the group and put an eloquent case for the liberalization of the franchise. The governor listened to the complaints of the petitioners, promised he would give the petition his utmost serious consideration, but refused to act on the request because of the objections from members of his executive committee. The extension of the franchise, therefore, remained a heated political issue for many years. Week after week, the issue was kept alive in the columns of the Barbados Herald. In addition, Charles Duncan O'Neill made the issue a central plank in the campaign of the Democratic League. While in Parliament, he seized every opportunity to bring the matter before the legislature for debate. And night after night, in the Working Men's Association Hall at Passage Road, O'Neill made the liberalization of the franchise the subject of much heated debate. Apart from the issue of the franchise, the dreadful working and living conditions of the poor in Bridgetown and on rural plantations featured prominently in early 20th century Barbados. Deplorable housing, especially in the slums of Bridgetown, poor sanitation, widespread malnutrition, the outbreak of epidemics, high infant mortality rates, the exploitation of child labor, rampant unemployment, illiteracy, lack of trade union representation, slum tenantries, and the need for compulsory education were some of the ills of Barbados which required urgent attention. It was this state of affairs that spurred many political activists into action. O'Neill. In 1927, Charles Duncan O'Neill, for example, published a manifesto in the Barbados Weekly Herald, which gives some insight into the nation-building process that he thought should be put in place. This is a very interesting manifesto. Listen to what Charles Duncan O'Neill in 1927 is thinking about. Compulsory education, the liberalization of the franchise, the end of child labor, improved sanitation, slum clearance in Bridgetown, old age pensions as in England, the removal of the Better Security Act from the statute books. I will say some more about that later, and workmen compensation. The issue of child labor was one of the most vexing problems confronting the society at the time. A large number of children, estimated at 5,000 per annum, toil on the sugar estates in labor gangs from as early as 5 years old and never obtain even the rudiments of education. Many social commentators view this state of affairs as a gross exploitation of helpless members of the population. Members of the plantocracy, however, argued that the children were contributing to the upkeep of the colony's vital sugar industry, as well as looking after their basic needs. O'Neill disagreed vehemently. In fact, child labor gangs on the estates were described by Wickham as unchristian, barbarous, and inhumane. On another occasion, he referred to the child gangs as an unnecessary evil. O'Neill argued that this blatant injustice could be solved by the minimum expenditure on education, making it compulsory for all children to attend school to at least age 12. Writing on child labor in the Weekly Herald, May the 23rd, 1924, Colonel Wickham had this to say, and I want to quote Mr. Wickham again. He says, "No child has any right to be working for its living before it has reached its minimum standard of education. I will not believe that any decent man brought face to face with the problem will not shrink at the sight of these children of tender years toiling in the fields. Themselves are marked with the plough of knowledge. The state owes a duty to them, and it is the most cold-blooded and time-saving philosophy to say that they are gainfully employed and leave them to grow up in bestial and besotted ignorance, a menace to the neighbors, a disgrace to humanity, an affront to God himself." End of quotation. But those who control the state did not share his views. Stanley Clifford Thorne, prominent planter, assemblyman, and legislator, stated quite emphatically on one occasion in the assembly that the money voted for the police was much better spent than that on education. Edmund Beezer, speaking in the House of Assembly, argued that the children on the plantation were prone to pilfering and needed the cap, not education. He expressed the view that sometimes it was necessary to be cruel to the black population in order to be kind. The most prevalent response of those who dominated the legislature was to insist that to rid the islands of child labor gangs through compulsory education would be to involve the state in a costly burden of recurrent expenditure which could not be sustained. The matter of child labor would not go away as it was raised from time to time again in Parliament by members of the Democratic League and in the Barbados Herald by Colonel Wickham. In addition, O'Neill took to the streets with public meetings at Reed Street and Lower Greens, ventilating the issue. A delegation of the Democratic League met the governor and members of his executive committee sometime during 1924 and insisted that child labor gangs should cease. In December 1924, the Education Board imposed restrictions on the employment of children on the estates under 12 years old until they reached Standard 4. Child labor, unfortunately, continued on the estates well into the 1940s, and compulsory education remained elusive until the 1950s and 1960s. Apart from child labor, early 20th century Barbados was plagued with dilapidated shovels which passed for housing. Existing in Bridgetown were some of the worst housing conditions at Nelson Street, Cat's Castle, Ellis Village, Carrington's Village, Emerton, and Chapman Lane. To make matters worse, other slum conditions were being created at Bush Hall, Kent, Bank Hall, Clapham, and Kensington. For example, a housing report revealed at Cat Castle 6¼ acres with 179 dwelling houses, of which 62 were owner-occupied and 117 were rented. Of the 62 owner-occupied houses, 9 were overcrowded and needed repair, 19 were unfit for habitation, 31 were in need of repair, and only 3 were structurally sound. 226 families live in 179 houses. The average rent for a house house plot was 60 cents monthly and 260 cents for a house. Chapman Lane tenantry covered an area of 10 acres with 347 separate dwelling houses, of which 184 were owner-occupied, 161 rented. Of the 184 owner-occupied houses, 13 were overcrowded, 84 were unfit for human habitation, 76 needed repair, and only 11 were structurally sound. Only 11 of 184 houses were structurally sound in Chapman Lane. Subtle street tenantry of 1 acre with 26 buildings was considered one of the worst slum areas in Barbados. 21 buildings contained 76 families with a total population of 140. Of the 21 buildings, 14 were considered unfit for habitation, 1 was owner-occupied, and 6 were in need of repair. One British statesman remarked on one occasion that the West Indies were the slums of the British Empire. He could very well have cited housing conditions in Barbados to prove his point. When W.M. Macmillan visited the West Indies in 1934, he wrote in his book, A Warning from the West Indies, that a study of the West Indies is a study of poverty, and that the poverty he saw in Barbados and the wider British West Indies was greater than the peasants of West Africa and the Hottentots in South Africa. Despite the widespread poverty in Barbados, land speculators cashed in on the land hunger of the masses during the 1920s. Fresh from Panama, Cuba, and the USA having money to invest. Some estate owners subdivided portions of their estates in order to cash in on this thirst for land. Now, the need for land was so intense that one colonial governor referred to it as a land hunger. People wanted land. One estate owner, when he was accosted by his brother for subdividing his land and selling it to the blacks, remarked, "You are planting canes, I am planting niggers." What he meant is that the hunger for land was so intense that he could capitalize on it and make some money. Not that he was interested in giving land to anybody, but he recognized that there was a market there for land and he sold his land. I think it was at Bank Hall. For example, a syndicate made up of prominent citizens and merchants such as H.B.G. Austin, D.G. Simpson, and Norman Simpson purchased Bush Hall Plantation in 1922 for £8,000. It was then sold in lots ranging from 1/8 of an acre to an acre. The necessary amenities were never put in place. Hence, during the rainy season, these tenantries became slushy, impassable, and flood-prone districts subject to the outbreak of epidemics. O'Neill argued that this land speculation was pure exploitation of a vulnerable social group. He insisted that the speculators should be responsible for the provision of basic amenities. Of course, they refused. The Planter Assembly cited the cost as an inhibiting factor. Stanley Clifford Thorne, again, called for restrictions of these tenantries on the ground that they had the potential to create large and unmanageable bodies of electors, as well as take away a large portion of the estate labor. But the sad plight of the poor and the rural tenantries would not go away, and it manifested itself in various forms of political protest. For example, a lot of potato raids on plantations. For me, my assessment of these potato raids is that they were more than raids, that they were proven a short. Well, that they were forms of protest, they were political statements by people who could not express themselves and read and write, but they made political statements by their actions. They were perpetrated by bold and aggressive groups who, through their actions, were in a way making profound political statements. In 1917, a series of potato raids in St. Lucie and the Spikeston area forced the local authorities to offer a reward of £25 for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrators. On the night of March 1st, 1918, the Bell Estate was raided by a group of 18 people who made a violent assault on a constable who interfered with their nocturnal activities. At Mount Standfast Plantation, 3 men carried off 650 pounds of Indian corn fodder. At Porter's Estate, 14 men stole 200 holes of potatoes, fired 4 shots at the constable. On June 22, 1921, 20 men stole an acre of provisions from Rock Hall Estate, St. Peter. In 1935, a series of raids on plantations in St. Lucie left the colonial authorities more than alarmed. Some of these raids appeared to be organized and firearms were used on occasions. This behavior led the ruling classes to rant about these armed gangs which threatened their life and their property. They insisted that the potato raids were the acts of seditious elements who should be stamped out with the full force of the law and the backing of the state. The local press, dominated by the local planters, took a similar position. The agricultural reporter insisted that the potato raiders were the work of the, quote, lawless, idle vagabonds who were found in the thousands throughout the island, unquote. The Barbados Standard called them a riotous mob and a common herd who deserved the cap. The Barbados Advocate dismissed them as, quote unquote, the dogs of the countryside. The Barbados Globe wrote, and I want to quote from the Barbados Globe because you see the thinking and the mentality of those who were in charge. We believe in the healing influence for the good of the cat, and as often perhaps as any of our contemporaries strenuously advocated its use when the culprits happen to have already passed beyond the stage of reform, unquote. Colonel Wickham and Charles Duncan O'Neill, were only two of a few citizens who demonstrated any sympathy for the poor. In fact, Wickham took on that vicious press by himself. He suggested that a distinction should be made between armed raiders who stole crops for market and those who stole to satisfy genuine hunger. O'Neill argued time and time again that a state which neglected its duty to the masses by allowing illiteracy to run rampant, ignores the social scourge of unemployment, and permits malnutrition, could expect such behavior from the poor. In short, predatory larceny was a form of protest to satisfy unmet needs. The warning pleas to address discontent among the black population fell on deaf ears. Instead, the ruling elite used the justice system of the 1920s and 1930s to keep social discontent in check. The courts were harsh when dealing with the poor. Some cases from the magistrate court will highlight the apparent abuse of the power by the judiciary. Beresford Moore, 11 years old, received 12 strokes with the Cambrian rod for stealing a sugarcane valued at 1 pence from George Seeley. Gordon Alkins, 13 years old, 8 strokes for stealing a quantity of cocoa from a lighter. Henry Braffett, 8 years old, received 10 strokes for stealing 3 ears of corn. Francis Johnson, 9 years old, received 8 strokes for stealing a green sugar apple valued at a penny from Hackett Hall Plantation. Richard Mears of Seaview, St. James, for stealing 2 breadfruits, was ordered by Magistrate Kenneth Graves to receive 4 days imprisonment and 20 lashes with the cap. On appeal, the sentence was reduced to 4 days and 10 lashes with the cap, so he still got the cap. These offenses were committed by very young children who, in the majority of the cases, as the court heard, live a life of severe material deprivation, neglect, and illiteracy. Yet there is no evidence that any attempt was made by the members of the judiciary to understand how this deprived social environment impacted on the juveniles' behavior. They were simply regarded as common criminals and in some cases received punishments which did not appear to be commensurate with the crime. This insensitive approach to the plight of the poor was based on a vicious racial ideology and stereotype and a social Darwinist philosophy so rampant among some members of the white community. They argued that black Barbadians had limited wants and needs, that they were inherently lazy by nature, thriftless loafers, prone to stealing, easily excited, as one colonial governor put it, shirkers of work, and loose in their sexual relations. Such people, they argued, must be ruled with an iron fist. Moreover, wage increases were seen as counterproductive because they encouraged black lazy laborers to work less in order to satisfy their limited needs. Many members of the white community insisted that lots of work existed on the plantations, but idle blacks refused to work. On the plantations, the Masters and Servants Act created a kind of archaic, feudal mixture of paternalism and servitude, where low wages and bad working conditions were the norm. Insecurity of tenure, therefore, was the fate which confronted the black working classes. Any laborer who failed to give 5 continuous days of work on the plantation, or who absented himself without good cause, or worse yet, encouraged other workers to strike, breach his contract. His actions could lead to dismissal, victimization, blacklisting, or prosecution in the magistrate's court. For example, Darrell Greenidge of Farm Plantation in St. George, he made a complaint in the magistrate court for one of his workers, William Gittins, a located laborer. Gittins was fined 8 shillings and 2 shillings cost for absenting himself from his stipulated duties of 5 days without lawful authority or excuse. Hubert Carter, a located laborer of Moncrief Plantation, St. John, was fined $5 payable within 14 days, or the alternative of a week imprisonment with hard labor for absenting himself from work for 5 days. In 1931, Robert Weir, a located laborer at Halton Plantation, had the audacity to transfer his services to Sunbury Plantation without notifying his former employer. He was fined 10 shillings and 2 shillings cost, payable in 14 days with the alternative of a month's imprisonment. The merchant planter class of the early 20th century Barbados had descended from a class who had survived many challenges during the period of enslavement by dealing firmly with any resistance or rebellion on the part of the black inhabitants. In essence, the local white elite's survival was almost assured by their long experience in the successful handling of the black population. All slave revolts were brutally put down, and the rebellions of the post-emancipation era, such as in 1976, were harshly suppressed. At the turn of the century, they had a long, successful history of managing the black population. This mechanism was very succinctly explained by George Carrington, absentee planter before the 1897 West India Royal Commission. I want you to listen carefully. Carrington is literally going to explain how they keep blacks in line. Listen to Mr. Carrington. The Barbadian Negroes are more civil as a rule, especially in daylight in Barbados, to us and to the managers. But you will see the same nigger goes down in a fortnight afterwards to Demerara. He will stand and look the manager in his face and cheek him in any kind of way. It is that in Barbados, we have an ample command of the laborer. There's such a lot of them that they must work and must behave themselves. And it is their home place. That is why we get hold of them. And they know they may lose ground. In Demerara, they are in such demand that they can do just whatever they like. And they go from one place to another. There's no owner to look after them, unquote. Carrington's testimony revealed the system of control used to keep the black laboring classes in their place under the local tenantry system. It deprived the black workers of ownership of land, but compelled them to work on the estates with little security of tenure and under the constant threat of expulsion. In essence, the workers feared for their very existence. For once expelled from the estate, there were few employment opportunities and therefore slim chances of survival. In addition, mechanisms were put in place to prevent the mass exodus of laborers from the island, thereby ensuring an abundance of cheap, reliable labor for the estates. Carrington's testimony also, in a way, revealed that black Barbadians were not passive by nature, but were clever in recognizing how to mask their feelings and intentions while in the clutches of a powerful ruling class. Such circumstances necessitated that any political action must be well-timed. Whenever the opportunity presented itself, they would assert themselves. A good example was demonstrated in 1927. Before 1937, trade unions were illegal and so non-existent in Barbados. Hence, the workers in both the rural and urban environments found themselves almost at the mercy of their employers. Now, at this point in time, I want to turn my attention to the 1927 dock workers' strike. Now, there was a dock workers' strike in Barbados in 1919. There was another one, short one in 1937, March of 1937. But 1927, dock workers' strike was one of the most volatile and challenges by the workers to the establishment. Around April 1927, the lightermen and the ship laborers in Bridgetown went on strike demanding increases in wages and better working conditions. This was a grouse that went back to 1918. The men considered the scale under which they were to load lighter cargo as burdensome and demanded an adjustment. They demanded $2 a day. Listen for these conditions, $2 a day, an hour for lunch, a working day from 7 a.m. to 5 o'clock. And after 5 o'clock, double time. Since, as I mentioned before, there were no trade unions, or at least trade unions were illegal, the men asked Charles Duncan O'Neill to represent them. O'Neill wrote the shipping firms on their behalf, but only one replied. That is HBG Austin's firm. O'Neill then wrote Governor Charles Robinson complaining about the unsatisfactory results at negotiating on behalf of the workers. The governor's reply to Dr. O'Neill was tantamount to a gross insult and dismissive. He suggested that it was the workers' responsibility to put their case to their employers, not Dr. O'Neill. He argued further that the dispute was a private matter between the workers and their employers, which was of no concern to Dr. O'Neill. The strike was broken in a few days as it started on April the 9th and it petered out on the 19th of April. The men would return to work at their old scale of wages. Wickham lamented in the Barbados Herald, and I want to quote Wickham because it summarizes what really happened. He says, "For Barbados is overpopulated, labor disorganized, and men must work, whatever be the conditions of employment, or starve. To paraphrase a famous utterance to suit the occasion, labor can only strike on a full stomach. End of quotation. The strike exposed the strength for the employer class in Barbados. Only Wickham, writing in the Barbados Herald, and another newspaper, the Weekly Illustrated, backed O'Neill in the dispute. The agricultural reporter, with Grantley Adams as a leading writer, attacked O'Neill in the most vicious way. O'Neill was denounced as unpatriotic, a rabble-rouser of the worst kind, out to upset the racial harmony and tranquility in the island. Adams on one occasion accused him of quote-unquote swollen-headed egotism. Erskine Ward called him an ass. He was accused of leading the workers astray and causing an unnecessary strike. The 1927 dock workers' strike was a humiliating defeat for the workers and any attempt to become organized. From this point in time, it became clear to O'Neill that the workers had to be organized if they were to make any progress. He set about to achieve this largely through the formation of the Working Men's Association. Now, he formed the Working Men's Association around 1926, 1927. I mentioned the Democratic League, which was formed in 1924, and the Democratic League was used for campaigning for office to the Assembly. In my opinion, the Working Men's Association was more the organization on the ground, organizing the workers. The merchant planter elite reasoned that the Barbados Herald had to go. Now, let me pause here to say that the Barbados Herald newspaper, of which I've quoted so much from, was started in 1919 by Clennell Innes. And in 1925, Clennell Wickham took over the editorship of the Herald, and it evolved as a newspaper that stood out for its defense of the poor and the underprivileged and the working classes. So many merchants and planters were very hostile to the Barbados Herald, and they wanted to get rid of it. They got the opportunity in 1930, and this is how it happened. In the 1930s, the election in the city, there were 5 candidates in that election, including a Bridgetown merchant named Walter Bailey and Erskine Ward. Wickham used the Barbados Herald to back Erskine Ward. Apparently, Bailey got offended and withdrew the advertisements from the Herald and demanded $3 that Wickham owed him. Wickham told him to his face one day in the Herald's office that he considered him to be petty and small-minded, and that a man can support one person in a political contest without having any ill will towards another person. You see a lot of it in Barbados. People always believe because you support one person, you necessarily got a grouse with another person. It is not like that. So this is how it unfolded. In the 1930 elections for the city, there were 5 candidates, including a white merchant, Walter Bailey, and Erskine Ward. Wickham used the columns of the Herald to support Ward. Bailey apparently got annoyed and withdrew his advertisement from the Herald, as well as to demand the payment of $3 to his firm. Wickham thought the action petty and said so face to face and in an editorial of the Barbados Weekly Herald of Saturday, February the 8th, 1930. Now I want you to bear with me because I want to read this editorial and you will really get the picture of what went on. Wickham was a very good writer. He can deal with you when he wants to deal with you. And this is what he had to say in that editorial. My readers will accept my apology for referring to a personal matter today, but not so personal either, as I shall show. There are lessons to be drawn from the incident, and I shall not let any false sense of propriety stand in my way. Everybody knows that there were 5 candidates in the city election. With the best will in the world, no man could support them all. I decided to support Mr. Ward because I felt, and still feel, that the colony has a right to the use of the intelligence and public-spirited young men. Nobody denies Mr. Ward either of these qualities. It is possible in an election to support one candidate without having the least ill will towards the others. I had none. If I had, I would have made it known. I am not such a model of discretion as to conceal my opposition to any man politically. It is not the first time that I have been deceived, and it will not be the last, so that the personal aim of the matter does not count for much. But it is important to consider the implication of Mr. Bailey's act. In the first place, it is clear he does not grant me the right to exercise my vote as I think fit. And secondly, he shows himself to be the type of man who would pursue, with all the rancor of an implacable private vindictiveness, any citizen who had the misfortune to differ from him politically. In other words, to show himself to be a man whose hands power could not be placed. There is no agreeing to differ with him, no shaking of hands with opponents at the close of an honorable fight. No. If he cannot win in the Senate Hall, he will try what financial pressure can do to his opponents. Suppose I had owed his firm $3,000. Suppose I had not been able to pay him even the enormous sum of 13 6. I shudder to think of the consequences. The moral is plain, at least to me. There's a lot of work to be done before political, economic, and social life in Barbados can be put on anything like a satisfactory footing. To accomplish that end, men of goodwill are wanted. For that work, breeding will tell. And thank heaven, breeding is not purchased. It cometh from on high. It is, however, disturbing when men like Mr. Bailey, who make a boast of their great wealth, are deficient in the qualities of good taste, good humor, and that indispensable quality of gentility which enables a man to take defeat like a man. The matter goes further. What can we expect from those illiterate people whose unfortunate position Mr. Bailey possesses to deplore? A man can only use the weapons at his disposal. Mr. Bailey would use economic pressure to throttle all opposition. The man in the streets following his example will have to resort to physical force. The result is disastrous anyway. So after that then, this is the statement, this final paragraph, that's going to become in trouble and see the demise of the Herald. I continue. However, for 1 week at least, the Herald is safe. I have a faint suspicion that the work it has done for the past 10 years will be remembered long after Mr. Bailey is clogged with dust. I have an abiding conviction that he is the only one of the 5 candidates who could be such a contemptible creature, unquote. Now, it is this contemptible creature, the statement. Grantley Adams was a very, very able and capable lawyer. Nothing else said in this editorial was used by Grantley Adams except contemptible creature. And he used it in the case that was brought against the Herald. Walter Bailey brought a case against Wickham claiming damages for libel alleged to be contained in the article. Grantley Adams appeared for Bailey, Hilton Vaughan and Erskine Ward appeared for Wickham. The special jury awarded the staggering verdict of £1,450 on costs to Bailey. Wickham could not pay the costs, and the Herald was sold. Now, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I always heard my grandfather say to me, make the statement that Adams destroyed Wickham paper. I never understood what he meant. Because he worked in a rock quarry, his colleagues would come at his house and they would always be arguing either about cricket or politics, something. And he always made that statement. So later, in university, I researched this with a passion because then it made sense to me what he said to me as a little boy. Well, you know that the Herald ended there under the editorship of Wickham. From 1933 until his death in 1938, Wickham went into exile in Grenada. He worked with T.M. Marishaw with the West Indian paper. However, he wrote a weekly column here in the Barbados Weekly Advocate. But the Herald ceased as a newspaper that defended the interests of the black working classes. It continued under the editorship of Erskine Ward, but it was not the same thing as when Wickham was its editor. With the advent of the Barbados Observer in 1934, under the chairmanship of Winter Crawford, another organ for championing the interests of the working classes emerged. Crawford from 1934 wrote extensively about the need for slum clearance and housing schemes, improved sanitation, increased expenditure on education, solving unemployment, immigration schemes, eradicating malnutrition and child labor on the estates. But special mention must be made of Crawford's highlighting of Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Now, let me also pause here to state that in 1935, Italy's Benito Mussolini invaded the African country of Ethiopia. It was unprovoked. Here was Mussolini arming Italy, a man who boasts to his mother that one day he would astonish the world. I feel that that's what he meant. And it appeared to the world as a very unfair fight. He was arming Italy. He had planes, tanks, poison gas. And in Ethiopia, hardly had weapons. He was able to overrun Ethiopia in a matter of days. However, the invasion and the expulsion of Emperor Haile Selassie had ramifications throughout the African diaspora, where it cemented in the minds of people and in the black communities that here was a powerful country taking advantage of a very poor and helpless African country. Now, I can't pay any attention to what happened in the diaspora, say in North America or England, but even here in the West Indies, there was a lot of protests. There were people who wanted to sign up. There were people who were urging Britain to enter the war on the side of Ethiopia. They were willing to take up arms. In Barbados as well, we protested. There was considerable protests in the print media by Winter Crawford and Colonel Wickham. Church services and prayer meetings were held throughout the island, and the UNIA, which I'm going to say something about soon, and the Working Men's Association held their open-air meetings in Bridgetown and some of the country districts, protesting against this Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The Italian-Ethiopian conflict had the effect of placing the struggle against imperialism and colonialism on the agenda of the local African Barbadian population. Garvey's teachings, especially in relation to the need for unity among descendants of Africa in the black diaspora, became crystal clear. In addition, this conflict raised the racial consciousness of the local black population. They cited hypocrisy on the part of Western nations in their dealing with Italy, and reasoned that if Ethiopia was a white country, they would have acted with firmness and quite differently. Some commentators who gave evidence before the Dean and Moyne commissions testified to a racial element in the riots of July 1937, which can be linked directly to this Italian-Ethiopian conflict of 1935. In fact, I look forward to Dr. Aviston Down dealing with this aspect of our experience in his lecture in this series on the Dean and Moyne commissions. With the Herald out of the way and becoming exiled, O'Neill continued the fight, especially in the Working Men's Associations. Meetings were held regularly at Workers' Hall, Pastors Road. Workers' Hall would be the building where the Berean church is now at the top of Pastors Road. That is where the Workers' Hall was located. And at Reed Street, at the corner of Reed Street, where they're thinking computers, I think that is the business place that is there. That is where they met and they held their meetings. In addition, Political meetings were held in the city, at Church Village, Dunlow Lane, Beckers Hill Village, Lower Greens, Chapman Lane, Gazette's Village, Carrington's Village, and Fairchild Street. O'Neill shook up the local political culture of Barbados with his raucous open-air meetings in the city and with his working class associates. I also want to publicly say as well that the way I look at history, I believe that it is about time that those who were not heard or seen in the historical discourse needs to be mentioned. And therefore, I want to mention some of these working class activists. In other words, O'Neill is a doctor, a middle class activist, but he surrounded himself with a lot of working class activists who were part and parcel of the campaign, part and parcel of pressuring the establishment and bringing about change in Barbados. People like George Bell, Moses Small, Edwin Turpin, Willie Bradshaw, Kenneth Wood, James Chase, Louis Siburo, Melvin Innes, and some women, a woman called Augusta Manning, Ann Hooper, Alexandrina Gibbs. Alexandrina Gibbs was in charge of the Reed Street branch of the UNIA. She was responsible for distributing the Negro World newspaper in Barbados. She also held a night school for children in Bridgetown, very active member of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Then there was Fitz Allen, John Allen, Leach World, Edwin Miller, Joseph Garner, and John Catwell. All of these fellows were bushers, carpenters, humble men, either belonging to the UNIA or to the Working Men's Association. O'Neill was an enigma for the white planters. They could not comprehend why a man of his stature, a medical doctor, would choose to associate with working class activists of the Working Men's Association. Night after night in Bridgetown, he held these political meetings attacking the planter merchant elite, calling for wage increases, improved working conditions, and extolling the virtues of Garveyism. For the black middle class, he was a traitor. Even some members of the Democratic League felt uncomfortable with his style. Every opportunity was seized to discredit him. He was called a rabble-rouser, a seditious vagabond, a Bolshevik, and a wicked agitator. However, some of O'Neill's working class supporters recognized his support for their cause, unlike other members of the black middle class. George Bell, speaking at a public meeting in Fairchild Street in 1927, had this to say, and he was standing on a 50-gallon drum when he was making the speech, as the police reported. He said, "Why Dr. Seeley and others of the leading class of the Negroes could not do as Dr. O'Neill has done and let the other fellows see that the professional class of the Negroes are uplifting the lower ones. Then they themselves will come along with us. How long are you going to allow yourselves to be always fooled?" End of quotation. On another occasion, Edwin Turpin, at a Working Men's Association political meeting at Gills Road, Eagle Hall, 1928, he made this speech from this shop step. He said, "Comrades, we are here in connection with the labor question. The Dr. O'Neill is a man of education. He has come to us to teach us the way that we may be able to better conditions and educate our children. Therefore, it is our duty to hold on to him and support this course. You will not find another man of his ability to come among us to teach us about life, whether political or social, or take part with us in anything else. Therefore, it is our duty to clamor for that which is right. Where are those black Arizonians? Why don't they come here and assist their poor color up? The only one that you will see night after night is the great Dr. O'Neill." End of quotation. From Bridgetown, O'Neill attempted to organize the workers in the rural districts. I am convinced that this was a tactical move on his part. He had learned his lessons from the 1927 dock workers' strike. And he set about organizing these Working Men's Association organizations in the rural district. It is in the 1980s, as a postgrad student, on Sunday evenings, I would take up my camera, my tape recorder, and heading to these rural districts and interview all the folks and piece together the evidence from the oral testimony and what I can find in the archives, and a number of things I was able to discover. For example, he had an organization at South District. There were 72 members, and a man called William Tacky Greenwich, a shopkeeper, was his secretary. These meetings were held on Sunday afternoons at the home of Arthur Wallace Wilson. He also had another organization at St. David's Village, and Theophilus Ashby, a carpenter, was the secretary of the branch. The meetings were held every Monday night, and Mr. Alfred Critchlow and George Hewitt were involved in organizing the branch. In the early 1920s, it is said that Wilfred Blackman took the organization to Sergeant's Village in Christchurch. He also had another organization at Venture in St. John. About 150 members joined up in 1930. The meetings were held at the home of Edmund Braffett, a baker. At Pori Spring in St. Thomas, O'Neill held his meetings at a house in Spring Bottom, and Johnny Grimes and John Morris were the organizers. At Bell Plain in St. Andrew, William Worrell was the main organizer, and the meetings were held at a blacksmith shop. By 1929, O'Neill was boasting of having a membership of over 2,000 and a reserve of over $2,200. And as you know, O'Neill organized a grocery at this, in Baxter's Road, set up various organizations, a loan and friendly society, and he tried to establish one at Checker Hall in St. Lucie. Last week, George Bell made reference to Marcus Garvey and his success in organizing 6 million workers worldwide. And Dr. Bell put the Garveyite movement within a global context. You know that Marcus Garvey was successful in organizing these 6 million workers. He had his own shipping line, his own Black Star newspaper, which also came to Barbados and which Alexandrina Gibbs distributed in Barbados in the 1920s and the 1930s. Well, the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, also established itself in Barbados. I've been able to trace branches, about 6, 4 I'm sure about. The first branch of the UNIA in Barbados was established in 1919, and it was made up of the old war veterans. John Catwell, that I just talked about, and Louis C. Bro and others were these war veterans that were in this organization. Like the UNIA, like the WMA, the urban branches were established at Reed Street and Westbury Road, and in the rural districts at Crab Hill, St. Lucie, and Indian Ground in St. Peter. The Indian Ground branch of the UNIA was administered by 2 ardent Garveyites, H.I. Gill, the village shopkeeper, and Cyril Foster, speculator. The meetings were held in Mr. Gill's shop. The Crab Hill division of the UNIA, under the guidance of Gladstone Leacock, appeared to be a vibrant organization. I discovered that Gladstone Leacock emigrated to Cuba in the 1920s. He was a member of the Havana Garveyite organization, and when he returned to Barbados, he started the UNIA branch at Crab Hill in St. Lucie. By 1920, the UNIA was holding meetings regularly in Bridgetown and throughout the country districts. Police following them all about and taking notes. That is how I know so much about what they did. Actively politicizing and mobilizing the black population. In 1923, Governor O'Brien wrote to his superiors complaining that he had some hotheads in the UNIA who were sending threatening letters to the planters and urging the workers to strike. O'Neill joined the members of the Democratic League, such as Christy Braffett, in the House in 1932. Other prominent citizens were members of the Democratic League, like Reginald Wilson, J.A. Martineau, J.T.C. Ramsey, Erskine Ward, C.A. Innes, Clennell Innes, and Clennell Wickham. There he had an uphill battle in his attempt to bring some change in the plight of the masses. He raised concerns about poor sanitation, unemployment, education, hot meals for school children, some parents, underemployment, and the franchise. From around 1933, his death his health was on the decline, and he died unexpectedly in October 1936. O'Neill was a socialist reformer and a Pan-Africanist with a clear vision for progress for Barbados. Between 1924 and 1936, his Democratic League changed the face of Barbadian politics. It printed manifestos in the Weekly Herald and brought the plight of the poor into the national discourse. In addition, through the Working Men's Association, O'Neill raised the consciousness of workers in Bridgetown and set up his platform in the various districts throughout the island. The UNAA and the Working Men's Association provided a training ground for activists, as Bell quite rightly showed last week, who would later play a leading role in the infant Barbados Progressive League and the Barbados Workers' Union. Apart from Samuel Jackman Prescott in the mid-19th century, no one had approached local politics like Charles Duncan O'Neill. His open-air meetings changed the political culture and climate of Barbados. Some of his ideas for reform, such as compulsory education and old age pensions, came in the post-1937 era, but the groundwork for social and economic change was laid during the O'Neill-Wickham years. O'Neill proved to be a man of strong convictions who sided with the poor and underprivileged against a powerful white oligarchy, much to the detriment of his professional development. Many members of the white elite and even the black middle class could not understand why a brilliant doctor with a bright future would choose to associate with working class activists and attack the merchant planted elite. He was ahead of his time in terms of his thinking. He had a clear vision for the future development of Barbados, and he worked tirelessly for improvement of the masses. When O'Neill died in November 1936, a vacuum was created in the political climate of Barbados. Enter Clement Payne on the political stage of Barbados on March the 26th, 1937. And he immediately injected some vigor again into the political life of the nation. With his grassroots activists, Menzies Chase, Ulrich Grant, Darnley Allen, Mortimer Skeet, and Israel Lovell, able campaigners from the UNAA and the Working Men's Association, Payne created a political storm with his attacks on the white oligarchy. He stressed the need for workers to be organized. He called for the establishment of old age pensions, workmen compensation, and compulsory education. He condemned in the most vehement way Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. His instant success alarmed the ruling classes, and his deportation led to the upheavals of 1937. I think that Professor Sir Woodville Marshall and Dr. Carter will deal with that aspect of Payne and what happened in Bridgetown and the rural districts in subsequent lectures. In conclusion, I attempted to explain the nature of Barbadian society and economy during the 1920s and 1930s. I have highlighted how a powerful merchant planter elite, with the support and backing of the British imperial system, exploited the majority of the black population. They were able to exploit the black population because of systems, structures, customs, practices, institutions, and laws put in place even before the 20th century to keep the black population in their place. I have argued that the white elite justified their right to rule and their domination of Barbadian society by invoking one of the most rabid forms of institutionalized racism in the region. They were influenced by Victorian attitudes to race, eugenic ideas, and social Darwinist philosophy of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. This ideology justified the gross exploitation and deliberate neglect of the black population. They therefore lacked a social conscience and were insensitive to the suffering of the masses in their midst. Whenever a crisis emerged in Barbadian society and the competence of the white elite was questioned and came under scrutiny, they invoked the doctrine of multiracial harmony. This doctrine declared that the local ruling elite was and has always been a benevolent, paternalist class who look after the interests of a happy, contented black population. The best of relations exist, they insisted, between the two races, or at least that race plays no part in human relations. The myth of multiracial harmony, for example, was summoned to explain the 1816 Boston Revolt. The blame was placed on misleading reports about freedom and loose statements by William Wilberforce. However, the majority of planters who testified before a select committee to investigate the slave rebellion spoke glowingly of excellent treatment meted out to the black enslaved population and how happy and contented the slaves were. In 1875, the planters spoke glowingly of, and I want to quote, peace and contentment, which as a rule characterize all classes of this colony, unquote. Yet, the 1876 Confederation Rebellion broke out in denial of this boast. Sir Harold Austin, in his welcoming address to the Moyne Commission at Queen's Park, right here on this spot, in 1939, spoke of the very best feelings of sympathy which exist between the government and the people of this community. The rebellion of July 1937 was so fresh in the minds of the local population that it took a lot of confidence, nerve, and optimism on the part of Sir Harold to believe that the very best feelings of goodwill existed in Barbados of the 1930s. Any turmoil in the island was always viewed as the work of foreign agitators and seditious elements. I have argued that Afro-Barbadians were viewed as lazy and barbaric and lacking in intelligence and ambition. Hence, they were allowed to wallow in their poverty and unemployment, poor sanitation and dilapidated housing in the rural and urban communities of Barbados. I have argued that that state of affairs which faced the black population was no accident, for a racist, eugenic, and social Darwinist philosophy was invoked to ease the conscience of the merchant planter elite and the colonial authorities and justify their lack of action. Any attempt to improve their lot was viewed with suspicion, and so Wickham, O'Neill, Wofford, and activists of the UNIA and WNA, for example, were perceived as agitators and troublemakers bent on upsetting the racial peace and harmony in the island. My assessment of local white merchant planter elite, I must insist, condemns them as a moribund bankrupt of ideas to take Barbados forward, useless and selfish, and out of touch with the changes brought about in the world as a result of the First World War. They were interested in their class interests, especially the vagaries of the sugar industry, but lacked the vision and the inclination to tackle the many social and economic problems confronting the black population. No doubt, the outbreak of the 1937 upheavals took them by surprise, despite they had put in place something called the Ceylon Plan. In 1918, the Ceylon Plan was an elaborate military structure that if there should be riots, how they would guard various areas, what was important. Yet, when the 1937 riot started, it took them by surprise. I reject the earlier assumptions proposed by some scholars that socio-political change in Barbados was generated by a benevolent and philanthropic ruling elite. We cannot ignore the efforts of the working class activists of the UNIA and the WMA and individual activists such as Fitzherbert King of Bank Hall, a man who wrote numerous petitions to the colonial authorities on behalf of the working classes. Then there was J. Arlington Newton of the Universal Electrician Union, who performed a similar role. In other words, the working classes and people of humble status made a contribution to their own liberation and to socio-political change in Barbados. It is wrong to deny them their rightful place in history by perceiving them as mere passive observers and pawns in the political discourse. I have been in a frantic search since the 1980s to find those invisible minds, those whose story have never been told, or who have been relegated to the forgotten histories of the Caribbean. So, the upheavals of July 1937 in Barbados and those in the Rider region, I would argue, were rebellions, not knee-jerk reactions of riots, which have been popularized. The actions of the rebels of 1937 would suggest that they were not mindless mobs, but highly politicized people with method in their madness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Excellent, Dr. Browne. You gave us a lot to chew on. You talked about the riots of the potato riots of the early 20th century. You talked about high infant mortality, the UNIA, the dock workers strike. A lot of issues you've raised in this very good presentation. We want to invite you to make a few comments, ask some questions, but please come to the microphone because this is being recorded. Any questions you may want to ask? I mean, any comments you want to make? If I may use the prerogative of the chair, I want to ask a question relating to the potato riots of the period 1917 to 1921. What were the main issues at play in those riots? Was it a wage issue, or was it an issue of hunger? Could you give us some more details on that?
I would say that there were a multiplicity of issues in that period. I've only highlighted a few. From the period at the turn of the 20th century, and you will know that these potato raids were part of what E.P. Thompson referred to as part of a moral economy. In other words, people who, in a way, reason that they are going to take from who have taken from them. And so it was, in a way, a kind of political statement based on how people see oppression. I would like to say first to you that I have dealt with potato raids in 1917 through to the 1922 into the 1930s. But that these raids went back into the 19th century. They can be identified in the 1870s. 1895, there was a serious outbreak of potato raids in Barbados. What I can say to you, you're going to see it again during the 1930s in the rural districts, the 1937 rioting in the rural areas, that people head straight for the plantation, they dig potatoes and such like. I would say that a lot of the issues centered around widespread poverty in many rural areas, and it was an issue of sanitation, it was an issue of wages, but I believe that many of the potato raids were a statement in the sense that the first symbol of oppression that the people thought at that time was a plantation. Like, for example, I made a calculation on one occasion where there was a raid on a plantation, and it was supposed to be done by 5 men, but they stole over 2.5 acres of yams. I asked some person who know how much constitute an acre yams. 1,500 holes. So I said to myself, if these persons have dug so many yams in a night, was it solely just to satisfy hunger, or they were making another statement, or were they selling them? I would suggest to you that there were many deep-seated issues burning. I reject the whole notion of explosion and rebellions and riots within a society as a kind of what some sociologists refer to as a frustration, aggression kind of hypothesis. In other words, people are discontented. It boils up underneath. And after frustration, they get aggressive. They're not balloons that burst after you put in air. However, I believe that deep down inside, political thought and actions are working deep, and that these things are used as outlets for expression. I told you about the system of control, and I believe this seriously, that there was a system of control in Barbados, and people were not foolish. They would not go and confront a powerful state apparatus. They use different ways of protesting, and when they get the opportunity, they would openly protest.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your very informative talk. You mentioned two instances where Grantley Adams seemed to oppose these progressive forces. Do you think at what point did Grantley Adams change his attitude or become more involved in the progress of black people?
That's a very good question. We always ask about that. Grantley Adams won a Barbados scholarship in 1919. He went off to Oxford. He returned to Barbados in 1925. What was interesting about Mr. Adams, and I give him his credit, that he was a very brilliant lawyer and very good organizer. As I look at this movement in the 1920s, I'm convinced that if Adams had joined up with O'Neill and Wickham, they could have toppled the planter class long before the 1930s. He chose to side with the conservative forces. From 1925-26, he was the leader writer for the Agricultural Reporter. And you read the newspapers at that time, he was always deeply embroiled in conflict and controversy with O'Neill. It is in the Agricultural Reporter I see these attacks on O'Neill, and I wonder why he attacked O'Neill like that. And he was always in a dispute with Wickham. One of those most outstanding disputes was over socialism. And Adams would claim that he's a liberal. In 1929, a meeting was held in Sprite Street for the support of A.J. Hanschel in the city. Adams was at that meeting. A fellow called T.P. O'Neill, I think he's related to Charles Duncan O'Neill, right at that meeting, pointed at Adams. He said, why you never join with the forces? It was a very interesting question, and the answer that Mr. Adams gives was also very interesting. He said that he didn't want to get involved with a radical organization. That is how he saw O'Neill. And that he believed in the principles of liberalism. That is the answer he gave. Now, I observed that Adams then won a seat in 1934. So he was in Parliament. But you can go and check the Hansards and the speeches and what he was saying. There was nothing about the support of the working classes in any meaningful way. I would say that he seemed to have seen the light at the outbreak of the July 1937 disturbances. He was the first before the Dean Commission, the local Dean Commission, to give evidence, and that that was his turning point. Now, I also know that in 1936 he applied for the post of Attorney General. Interesting. I'm very glad he didn't get it. Perhaps he would not have played the role he played in politics. He also applied for the post of Attorney General in 1938 when the Barbados Progressive League was now also becoming a political force and the workers' union. Again, he was turned down. So I would say to you, sir, around 1937, you see that important departure in terms of working class politics around 1937.
Somebody's coming.
Good night. The lecture was very...
Can't hear you, ma'am. Come closer to the mic. I can't hear you.
Is the mic on? Is it on?
Yeah, it's on, but I can't hear you.
Yes, I was saying thank you for the lecture. It was very informative. I have heard the old people, my parents included, saying that they paid a penny for their education. I'm wondering if you did any research in that, and two, what is being done today? As I go up and down and I see the school children taking their education for granted, I would like that somehow, when you spoke of child labor, where children had to work and could not go to school, that something in some way that this be put over to the young people today, that they understand the value of education and its way of bringing people and keeping people out of poverty. Because it's looking to me like what my generation got and built on, as if this generation is going to go back now to the coal pot, and they are on welfare and a lot of things, because to me they do not seem to understand the importance of education.
Yeah, very interesting question or comment. You heard me mentioning about compulsory education. Let me throw some light on what was meant then. Education was controlled to a large extent by the church, the Anglican Church, a few other churches. And the state put some money in education, but not on the scale that would allow every child to have an education. That is what O'Neill and Bickham and others were fighting for. I must say I've been to Crawford, Grantley, Adams later to put it on the table. The compulsory education is that you weren't compelled to go to school. As far as I'm concerned, the state didn't care. And those who attended school sometimes had to pay. You had to pay fees, even at the primary level. So you would understand that people who worked for a few shillings on wages, who could hardly buy food, the education of the children suffered. You had a situation where, because it was not compulsory, that you would leave school at a very early age to take care of your siblings or such like. So illiteracy was very high. So that is true, ma'am. Some people had to pay a very small fee. What happened in the 1960s I think it was 1962, 63, was the abolition of the paying of fees, especially to the grammar schools at that time. And the whole philosophy about education and the role that education should play in nation building changed. In the time that you were talking about, I'm convinced you had a class who did not see education in that way. In other words, the education, the mass is an investment in the mass of people for social progress, nation building, development of the economy wasn't seen. Unfortunate when I say that they were backward, I mean it, and I stand by it. That class were backward, they didn't see it. And not that they didn't lack it. Clement Payne talked about it. It's interesting that Colonel Wickham, I have prepared a publication of the writings, the 54 writings of Colonel Wickham that I'm going to publish, and you're going to see it for yourself. Repeatedly, Colonel Wickham wrote about the importance of education and education in nation building, and having a nation that is educated and people who can read and write. He thought that illiteracy was a curse on a nation. So in this period, very few people got education. In the 1950s and 1960s, and I'm going to get into the whole nonsense and debate about who introduced free secondary education, and that's a non-issue. What I can tell you is that the progressive forces, they called themselves the progressives in Parliament, Browne, Adams and company in the 1940s and Winter Crawford, pushed for education, for the building of an infrastructure. You can see it all around the place, building more primary schools. Eardiston Teachers Training College starting in 1947, training teachers, putting money into school meals and the development of school meals. Those progressive forces in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s changed the face of education. That is what it was all about. And we see what the investment in education has done in creation of a middle class and creating wealth in other areas of the economy. Now coming today, up to today, not living through that period, but studying it from a historical point of view, I'm like you, as a person who's been teaching and a principal, I'm very disappointed too in the attitude recently of the approach to education. I must say that I could forgive the students, but some of the parents are very stupid. Some of them got more money than they got sense, as a principal would say. In that, as a principal, I get very annoyed having to deal with students coming in school, shoes, brand name shoes, brand name clothes, violating all the rules and regulations and all sorts of things that have absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, nothing to do with education. Because I have, in my way, if I had time, I would tell you what my vision for education, what I see my role as a principal. Like, for example, I've wrote a strategic plan for Queen's College, and that strategic plan dovetails with the National Strategic Plan of 2020 to 25. That is the development of Barbados as a first world country by 2025. Objective 3 of that strategic plan relates to education. And I understood clearly what my role and the role of education should play in that development, and turning out people who can go out there in the world and compete and challenge, and who understand education and who can use the education to create wealth and such. Like, I understand that role. However, I agree with you, ma'am. We seem to be losing sight of the importance of education. We don't seem to value it. This generation that coming up, they got it all free, and they don't seem to understand the importance of it. And that there was a period of time when it was deliberately denied to the masses of people. That we went through that phase. Where men were stood up in Parliament and say that it is just necessary to give people the rudiments of education, that they don't want no more education than to be able to go out on a plantation and use a fork and a hoe. They don't see the reasons for giving people education to think and to function beyond that level. That was the backward thinking of some people who run this country for 300 years. Certain progressive forces attempt to change that thinking and to make education a central plank of even the basic civic rights of people. Today, it is very sad the way we look at education, and we need to get back on track. We need to spell out what we want to do with education and the role that we see in nation building. and national identity.
Dr. Browne, I get the feeling that there's a void in the dynamics of our history. I'm going to deal specifically with the 1930s. And I really hope that this falsification, or for lack of a better word, did not occur because of the guidance that came from the non-black writers that preceded historians like you. There's a lot being said about the UNIA in the early 1930s and about the contribution of its membership. But here is Israel Lovell, an ordinary working class man, in the leadership of the UNIA, rose to the point of being the president of the UNIA
1920.
in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And the history of the 1920s has given almost absolute credit to Clement Payne. While I respect the role which he's played, obviously his relationship with Lovell would have had to come as a consequence of Lovell's great influence on the UNIA at the time in the history of Barbados. I'm not seeing the kind of emphasis being placed on Lovell's contribution to the development of the history of Barbados in the 1930s, and I really believe that our historians need to focus some attention in that area of the dynamics of our history and try to fill that void. I would like to hear your views on that.
Yeah, I have come across Israel Lovell, and some of the information I got on him, I got really by accident, in the sense that I found it among the police records. The police were following him up and down, and everywhere he went there. I said the police were following Israel Lovell up and down, and it is among the police reports that we were able to piece it together. Israel Lovell and others formed an important activist group in the 1920s. I think that is what I was trying to highlight all tonight. And I do agree with you that we need to investigate it more. Call it rewriting the history or whatever. That is what. It is all in here, sir. We're going to have a lunch with Dr. Carter here. He's also producing one on the history of the late 19th century and the role of the rights and such like. That is looking at working class activism. I have dealt with that perspective of it. You'll notice tonight I talked a lot about the Democratic League. The Democratic League was formed in 1924. O'Neill, unfortunately, tried to enter the House in campaigning, but could not make it till around 1932. But he placed a lot of emphasis on worker organization at that grassroots level. With time, Israel Lovell and others would be highlighted. Now, what you have raised formed part of a debate that we had I think it was 3 years ago when we were over by the Barbados Workers Union. And it is this. I was making a case for the politicization of the masses by the same Israel Lovell and company. He was the president of the UNIA in 1920. And he's there in the records night after night, especially at the Westbury branch of the UNIA, making the speeches and such like. And I was making a case for the politicization of the masses in the 1920s by Lovell and others, in the UNIA and the WNA. But there's an interesting kind of paradox here in the sense that you were asked when O'Neill went off the scene in November 1936, why did it appear as though there was a lull and such like within the workers' movement? And why did Clement Payne have such an impact? I've heard the explanation that Payne walk and talk with the masses, and that O'Neill talked to the masses, and other things. It is a very complex thing. I've also heard of once when I think Dr. Carter here was with me when we were interviewing the late John Wickham in the 1980s. And he dismissed it as that, just simply Barbadians, just like a foreigner, that all along these members of the UNIA, the working class activists, were saying almost the same thing Payne was saying, but yet did not have the same impact. It is a complex thing to explain. But I do agree with you that we need to do more research. When you had the conference at university about 6 years ago, I did a paper on Moses Small. You ever heard of Moses Small? I admired him a lot. I saw him in the records. I really admire this man who was the police said he was a very gifted speaker, using on notes, to stand up and talk and talk and talk for hours about all sorts of matters. And he was a man of very humble birth. It resurrected Moses Small. It need to be more in-depth work on these various activists. But that is how I see the situation.
Thank you, gentlemen. Please excuse me, people. Pardonable pride. My class of 1983 at Community College, Henderson Carter and David Browne. Right. Although I'm not a historian. Right. Twistorian as I am. Good night, people. I'm currently teaching a course at Community College called Contemporary Caribbean History from Marcus Garvey to Michael Manley, 1930 to 1990. And a young lady, when we were trampling over this ground, sir, why y'all always talking about the men? What did the women do? How come we are seeing, you sent us down to the archives and we are seeing all these women, and how come there is no history on women in the activism of the 1920s and 30s? I heard you mention, Dr. Browne, Alexandrine Gibbs. Yeah. There's also Manning.
And Hooper.
Pardon?
And Hooper.
And Hooper. Yeah. And we've tried to look across the Caribbean. We see Bertha Mutt, we see Gladys Longbridge, later on Bustamante, we see Elma Francois, Una Marston, etc. People who were really fought. I'm sorry. And one of our students said that of the 14 people killed in Barbados in 1937, 6 of them were women. And how come nothing is ever said about them? So I want you to comment on that. But I also want, not to counter, but to ask about your peroration. In your peroration, you delivered what my colleague there sitting said was a caustic execration of the white working class. I want to be devil's advocate.
Not the white working class.
Sorry, the white elite. Very sorry. Conundrum, yes. But there is a white working class, yes, in St. John.
That's right.
And we have some work being done on that. But of the white elite. But in the 1920s, you see Christy Smith, church warden, and as we said, living just over here, being helped by whites in 1914 to purchase land from Bank Hall Plantation and establish Empire Club. We also see, no, I'm asking, there mitigating factors, and if there are any mitigating factors about this, the picture we see of a very grasping, rapacious, Simon Legree type of elite, because there is also Martinez, who establishes the frame food cricket, the Thursday League, and therefore stops people, as Herman Griffith once said to me, if we didn't have cricket, we would have eaten each other. So cricket is established, grounds are established by the white elite for the black working classes, and as a matter of fact, the Barbados Cricket League, formed in 1936, was held by a number of white planters. Surely there are other instances of what I say some mitigating factor among that white elite.
All right. Let me deal first with your first point of women. First point of pertaining to women. I got an idea about 2 years ago, even in a forum like this, where some of the feminists were saying, but we don't see women or we don't hear the women. They are there. In the records, it was difficult to find them. It was a man's word. Whenever we find women, we are very fascinated by it. As I said before, there were a few others besides those that I had mentioned, but Alexandrina Gibbs stand out in terms of her organization and her constant activism in the UNIA. So the women are there. It is true that the women took part in the riots, yeah. 6, I found, you said 14, I found evidence of 16 being killed, right? That is what the official record said, but 6 women. The night, as I showed that Dr. Carter would deal with this, when they're dealing with the riots and the nature of the riots and how it unfolds, you will find that at Sutter Street, and the night of the rioting, it was the women who were supplying the big rocks and stones to track the police, and the women were involved up and down in the movement. The women were in the organizations, the UNAA and the Working Men's Association as organizers and speakers. Some of those who recorded these things seem to have paid little interest in women. And the methodology in terms of highlighting the women and their contribution will call for a lot of detective work. But I take your point that you cannot ignore the women in the whole setup of the scheme. Now, to your question of the white elite, I want to make something clear here. My critique of what happened, I was condemning the white elite, ruling elite as a class and how they think. Some of them were very conservative, extremely conservative. Some, you can say, was benevolent and such like. That is well known. So when I talk about my caustic nature about the class, about the white class, I was dealing with them as a class and how they dealt and saw the working classes. It does not mean that there weren't progressives among them. You can identify people among them who did things for the black community and such like, and gave to the community. However, I got a problem. Let me explain what I mean. You notice I made a lot of reference to Stanley Clifford Thorne. How do you explain where there are some members of the white elite, like Mr. Thorne, Mr. Beza, Stanley Robinson, and others, who were willing to get up and say exactly how they feel about the black community? And even Wickham himself raised it as early as 1990. How come that there were a few who were of the most vicious towards the black community? There were others who never said it, but voted with Mr. Thorne all the time. They never condemn him. As far as they're concerned, they shared his view. It's just that they weren't brave enough to come up and publicly say it. That is something in race relations and the study of race relations that you always have to take into consideration. I would also say something to you, Mr. Marshall. In American historical methodology, there are some historians who talk about the reality principle. The reality principle suggests that sometimes in historical investigation, everything on the surface is not what really is there, that you have to probe below in order to get at the truth. I will say to you that there were some members of the ruling elite, and I recall some of the colonial governors warned them about it, that since Barbadians are so easily excited, as they say, we must learn to keep our true feelings to ourselves. So they would say one thing in Parliament, but when they got their personal diaries and letters to their relatives overseas, they got the truth. And they said how much they hated blacks. They said, anytime there's a black government leaving this place. I found the letters of E.M. Shilston, pillar of the white community, lawyer, member of the Museum Historical Society. But when he wrote to his brother, he said, I'm not staying in Barbados under any black government. They can't run the country, he's racist. In his private corridors in his bedroom. And that is where you find the truth. So they talk one thing publicly in Parliament, and they kill us slowly behind the scenes. You hated us. It's my duty to find them. And that is what happened in this case. So, Mr. Marshall, this is my answer to you. What people say publicly is one thing. What they think and they do is another thing. Sometimes in race relations, you have to pay a lot of attention to a person's actions and not their words. You understand what they say. So I'm suggesting to you that if you go, for example, into governors' private meetings with them, among their kith and kin, they relax and they tell the truth to one another. It was recorded and I got it. And I know what they thought about us. So don't tell me about no caustic. It's the truth.
Oh, good evening. I've got a question about the working class. Whether today's working class, how would you compare that with the working class you were just talking about in 20s and 30s? So it seems to me like the whole focus has dissipated, the lack of solidarity, identity, etc. And my own view is that the transformation of the economy from agriculture to services, i.e. tourism, means that you no longer have the kind of focus and goal to, better yourself, move forward, etc., to shake off the yoke. And not just the working classes, as the lady before me said, that the young people now don't see the value of education, because it's about where is this all lead into, where are we going, why should we grasp education with both hands? Because my parents and all the other parents wanted us to have a better life than they had. Now people are just taking it for granted that we've got there, we're not going anywhere else. And, we're just educated to export labor, as we always did. So we can't actually handle it right here and now. So it is like, where's the working class today? What can we expect?
I always have difficulty sometimes when you're asked to make comparisons over a very long time period. I'm saying that I always have a difficulty when you're asked to make these sometimes what may appear to be artificial comparisons over time. In other words, you are asking me about working class in the 1920s and the working class now. There'll be different times and different circumstances, and therefore sometimes the comparisons may be just comparisons, but there may not be any connection, or they may be irrelevant. I can see your point about the transformation of working class as a result of a transformation of the economy. The thinking is different. As I said before, with the question that the sister raised earlier about the value of education and how students value now, I believe that you can apply the same thing to the working class even now, that they see things differently from how it was seen in the 1920s and the 1930s. The struggles to survive in a very hostile environment in which what that 1920s and 1930s could teach us is that in any society, the thinkers can always keep this at the forefront of their minds. You must always, in your society, create the need or let people feel that there's always hope. There's always hope. What I found, for example, I hope Dr. Carter would deal with this when we deal with the writing. After the wrecks, there is in the archives some letters that were written by ordinary working class people explaining what they thought took place and how they felt about society then. And you find coming through this feeling of hopelessness in Barbadian and West Indian society. You should never get a society to the point where people feel that there's no hope for the future and there are no expectations. So I would say to you, the working classes, for me, of that period felt that way. Now, there are some, you ask about comparison of working class, there are some people who are saying, oh, what I see in Barbadian and West Indian society, we are due for more riots. Right? I don't understand what they mean, because the society is different. If we riot now, and we have upheaval, I think that people will riot for different reasons, and there are different circumstances. There is the view of relative deprivation, that what we saw in 1937 as central to the causation of rioting was this feeling of relative deprivation. That Panama and Cuba and money that came back raised people's expectations. Then it was all cut off at a point in time, and people were never able to realize to obtain the true, what they thought the true wealth and worth within that society, and relative deprivation led to a outburst of feeling and rioting. You can ask yourself if these various crises we go through create that feeling of deprivation to the point where we would explode. You remember the gas riots in Jamaica. The price of gas went up and the whole society exploded for a couple of days. What I am suggesting to you that there were deep down, there were feelings of discontent within the Jamaican population, and it was just the gas that triggered it off, the increase in the price of gas. Is there this discontent within Barbadian society? Do you believe that people feel so deprived now that some riot or something, if it is now, next 10 years, next 15 years, should happen? Where did the discontent start? Now, in this time of this recession, did it start before? People in Barbadian society, the poor and the underprivileged, feel that they got hope that I was just speaking about, that they got a future, that somebody cares about them, that they have the opportunity to progress and to move on, or is that being denied, and therefore you have another right. Now, I don't believe in this thing of comparing from one era to the next because it is different. But I want you to think about that as a possible explanation of how people may feel in this time about their circumstances and whether they feel that there's a certain group that taking all the wealth and everything in society and nothing is coming to them and to their children. How do you feel about the next 15, 20 years? Do you believe your children can get land? Or they'll be able to get a piece of the rock, to build a house, to move on where they live? Would there be a further education? Would we continue with this free education from nursery to university? All of these things create hope within people. We don't know the extent to which the feeling of despair sets in and that you have a right at a particular time. But I don't believe in this thing about they're over 70 years and had a right and we due for another one. It don't work like that. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Browne. Am I being heard?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, very quickly. I want to say several things here, and I'm hoping I can articulate them easily for you, so I'm clear. First of all, I want to say that this is the third time that I've heard you lecture, and I feel that you're one of the few historians that I hear in Barbados that I call they do not sanitize history, and I'm glad. I hope you continue in that vein. There are very few, as I told my friend Trevor several months ago, that a lot of historians I find just take what's there and they actually make it sound like it was okay, it wasn't all that bad, all right? And they sanitize by misleading and not telling the exact truth. And this is my third time hearing you, and I'm very impressed by how you can actually present facts in a very truthful way that I think represents what actually happened. Now, there are a couple of things that you actually mentioned earlier that I would like to maybe just very quickly touch on. You used the word potato riots. You also used the word prettier larceny. Now, I'm going to start with prettier larceny first and try to see if I can, because I'm getting confused by this. My conception of prettier larceny is that if I grow something and somebody else comes and steals it, that maybe is prettier larceny. Because I put my labor into something and somebody else comes to reap it. All right? Now, here's a situation that we actually had from day one in terms of our settlement, where we actually put our labor in something and we never owned it. Other people owned it. And how did they own it? Oh, they owned it through military might. So what I'm actually trying to say, that when we actually want to present history, maybe we may have to look at, again, not sanitizing it by actually using the kind of things that we have been taught in terms of the terms, but saying that maybe what we were doing, what those people were doing in 1937, people before that they were establishing the rights of their labor. All right?
Moral economy.
Sorry?
Moral economy.
Yeah, exactly. They were establishing the rights because who planted the potatoes? Who actually tended the potatoes to make sure that they didn't dry up? And when the potatoes were, when they had to be dug, who dug them? Certainly not the elite. All right? So I'm just trying to say here that maybe we have to start thinking about the box and start telling the truth as it is. We were establishing our rights of labor, and it has to be seen that way. And that's going to lead us to talking about the number of things that actually happened through 1937 and so on, establishing our rights of labor because of the fact that we actually were doing the work and they were actually stealing. So when we talk about black people were stealing, the elite were the ones who were stealing. The British behind them, who actually had a garrison here to make sure that any little riot and so on, or coming together black people, and actually it didn't even have to be a riot. All black people had to do was to come together in numbers, and it was regarded as a riot. All right, and they actually were here in their numbers to make sure that they actually were able to steal our labor. So I think that when we actually start talking about riots and raids, that we actually maybe have to see it in that particular sense, that we weren't stealing, we were establishing our labor. And I know that I'm not a big, I never studied philosophy a great deal, but the few philosophers, British philosophers and Scottish philosophers, that established themselves in the 19th century talked about what actually is ownership. And one of the things that they actually said is that ownership is when you put your own labor into something, it belongs to you. That never happened to black people in the diaspora. When we put our labor into something, it belonged to other people. And to me, they stole it from us. Now, this is going to lead me to ask you another question about, in terms of reestablishing our rights of labor, the fact that we were not given any compensation for even today. I am very much interested in how that connects with this whole view of reparations. And I would like to hear maybe if you have any thoughts about the connection between establishing our rights of labor and the whole business of reparations.
Dr. Carter just whispered to me that, first thing to me, say something about the potato riots. You see it turn up a lot in the correspondence of the colonial administrators. They call it potato riots because there were lots of ground provisions. By the way, the people were stealing yams and cassava and peas and such like, but as long as you went on the plantation and you stole corn and such like, it was called potato raids and potato riots. I think largely because a lot of sweet potatoes were grown and they would take the potatoes. So I think it was a cover term for all sorts of things. As a matter of fact, one colonial administrator said that they were stealing potatoes because they like potatoes and they have this propensity for potatoes. So that is a broad term for dealing with the raiding on plantations and occasionally the theft of crops. Predatory larceny, you know, is still with us. It's still a complex thing to deal with, and you always have to make this distinction of when you go just to steal to get produce. Now, Dr. Carter told me that on the 6th, there's an invitation to you to come. He's going to deal with this whole idea of rioting on plantations, and the moral economy is something pushed by fellows like Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson as an explanation for the behavior of people in these circumstances. And I've borrowed that methodology to apply to the 19th century in the West Indies. The moral economy really is a feeling like what you were saying, what you call the rights of labor. The people who were doing it felt that they weren't doing anything wrong, that they were taking from those who took from them. And that, as you say, they planted them so they can take some, and that they feel deprived and that they weren't getting their true worth. So Dr. Carter is going to deal with that. But that is an explanation for what these people were doing. And as I say, I'm convinced that they were making a political statement by what they were doing. Now, to compensation, there's a long debate and election itself, that we know that the planters in the Caribbean got 20 million pounds compensation, the ex-slaves got none. What is interesting in the United States, with the Abraham Lincoln's proclamation in 1863, that in America, a civil war was on, and the United States Congress and the executive never compensated the planters. They just freed the slaves and such. That's another discussion. I say publicly that I believe in the whole notion of reparations, and that the reparations don't necessarily have to mean a monetary value, because I think the calculation has shown that what has happened to blacks, not only in transatlantic slave trade, but other slave trades off the African coast, the value, the conversion will be almost trillions of dollars that even the industrialized countries that benefited from the exploitation of Africans over many centuries in terms of the loss of life and the exploitation of the resources in Africa and in the Caribbean that they could not pay. So I would want to say to you, yes, I believe in the principles of reparation. The Jews get theirs. And Germany, right now, Germany rebuilding the synagogues and such like that that were destroyed in the night of the long nights and other things, and the pogroms that happened to Jews during the Nazi regime. Others are compensated. It's about time that the people of African descent in Africa and the diaspora receive the just shares from the first world countries. They know who they are. They know what they have done to us. But I would say that the reparations can come in many forms. It can come in concessions. It can come in trade agreements. But the backwardness and the lack of progress and economic development in Africa and other places cannot be traced solely to modern theory and understanding and policies. It had its fundamental bit of underdevelopment going back to era. So the reparations is a long debate. The first order of business is to recognize that you've done something wrong, to say you're sorry, and then we can discuss the nature of the reparations, whether in terms of monetary value or the concessions to African nations and people within the African diaspora.
I want to thank Dr. Browne for his lecture. We have witnessed tonight strong research in the 1930s and 20s, a well-delivered lecture with passion, and very full answers. And I want to congratulate him for all of those things again. Give him a round of applause. Excellent work. And we look forward to the book on Clenor Wickham. I want to thank you, the audience, for your patience, your understanding, your questions as well. Very pertinent questions. We thank you for the audience. Give yourself a round of applause. Well, thanks the sponsors of this event. Without them, it could not have been possible. The Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the Department of History and Philosophy of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, the National Cultural Foundation, and the Insurance Corporation of Barbados Limited. Let's give a hand to the sponsors. Refreshments are available at the bar and they're free, so please partake. I also want to say that donations to the work of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society are appreciated, and your donation will assist the museum in carrying forth its mandate to collect, document, and conserve evidence of Barbados's cultural, historical, and environmental heritage. The next lecture will be delivered by Professor Pedro Welch on the 28th of February here at the Steel Shed, 7 o'clock. I want to thank you for coming out. Before you go, Ms. Cummins, the director of the museum, is going to make some remarks. And I'm sure that will be brief.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter. And I would like to join you in offering congratulations to our speaker this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, we are taking a small side trip during the course of this very interesting and enlightening lecture series on the 1937 labor rebellions. Indeed, next Tuesday, the 21st, at 7 p.m., the museum will be the venue for an illustrated talk by the other side of the coin, the Earl of Howard, David Lascelles. He is giving a talk on landscape and history, reframing Howard. His talk is obviously about the Lascelles family who built Howard House and who were in the business of sugar and the slave trade. What role does Howard have in the continuing debate about 21st century Britain and the legacy of Howard and Britain's histories? This talk is being delivered at this time because, in some sense, I'd like to inform the audience. The LaSalle's family, the Earl of Howard, are coming to Barbados to begin, if you like, a process of more than intellectual compensation in terms of the return of digitized archives that have been held in their family for hundreds of years. The LaSalle's slavery archives will be shared with both the University of the West Indies and the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and they become an additional historical research resource that may have implications for many of our families who want to know more about their genealogical origins. So please take the opportunity to join us and to hear, as I said, perhaps some part of the other side of the coin next Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the Barbados Museum. Thank you for your attention.